but he said he has a commitment, so he.
So he just the reason why he's not here is because he offered me some Arabic coffee and I couldn't resist. So he made another cup for me.
Totally understandable.
Oh, he's here.
Totally understandable.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So this is wonderful.
Is it only for
You want for everyone?
Is it only for favorite
No, I don't want it.
professor?
I don't want
First
it.
of all, it is not, and if I could prepare some more.
No,
This
no.
is
Thank
Turkish
you so
coffee
much.
from Palestine, Israel, sent by my mother.
See, I call it Arabic coffee.
Excuse me?
It's a big debate in the Middle East. I call it Arabic coffee.
Exactly.
It's
This is
Arabic.
exactly
We're going to talk about the
about
subject.
millions of people.
Turks,
But they don't mix so much. They
Okay.
You want to see?
No,
Well,
I'm saying that they make.
Some
it
Palestinian
perfect. Is it
commentators
too
say
low?
that there's a difference in cardamom, like one adds cardamom or not, whether it's Arabic or whether it's Turkish, etc. So there are some. That in itself would be a good. So why don't we?
Well, this is wonderful,
you can-
introductions.
introductions.
Introduction, and, well, this is wonderful. We're very happy you're here. Mark and I would have a good time if you weren't, but it's better now that you are, of course. And we are launching with this event, the Escar Salon. And Salon is not to cut our hair, it's to basically kind of recreate, dare I say, a type of exchange that was very popular in Europe, dealing with social and current issues of the day, participating where, as it were, the intelligentsia, but that, I think, is a broad range. And we are, Mark actually came to me with a wonderful idea about talking about philosophy and conflict analysis and resolution. So we're exploring the intersection of philosophy and our field. Philosophy broadly defined, our field more broadly defined, however we define it. And each session will be topical, and we will see what develops at the moment. So we should go around and introduce. So, Mark, do you want to add, correct, or whatever?
No, I agree completely with what you said, and I think we should just get to knowing who's here.
Yeah, get to, yeah. So
So why don't we begin with name and affiliation? Yes.
All right. Well, my name is Chukuma Onye.
Chuhuma.
Onye, yeah, but I'm called Chuck. It makes it easier for Americans to pronounce. This is my second year in ESCA program, master's program for ESCA. Hopefully, we'll be done by the end of this semester.
And I'm Douglas Irvin Erickson. I'm a fellow here at ESCAR with the Genocide Prevention Program.
My name is Adomi, and I'm a second year PhD student.
I'm Farzana. I'm a master's student. I will be around here for a long time, so I can rely on me.
I'm Ibrahim. I'm a PhD student as well.
Karina Kristalina, faculty here.
I'm Michelle. I work with Marc at CRDC, and we also have a friend in Canada joining us remotely. You can't see him or hear him, but Nick Cherwinski from Royal Roads University is viewing it online.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, friend from Canada.
One of our students has been very faithful and done fabulous work on the ground with us in Palestine, Israel, and Turkey, Syria.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to start on this topic, and I just want to mention that really we don't know what's going to develop. It's spontaneous. It's totally informal, and whatever happens, I know that at least Mark and I will enjoy the moment. And if something happens from that in terms of ideas, that would be wonderful. So should I start?
Yeah, you start. I mean, the genesis of this is that we wanted more philosophical conversations, and I basically went to Dan and said, and this is a problem with faculty in general, is that we don't talk to each other because everybody's very busy with what they do. And I always felt that philosophy is at the core of my decision-making every day on difficult issues. And yet I don't share that with anybody. and I don't even have time to share it with Dan, who's also from philosophy.
And I also
So-
have a philosophy background.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I
You see,
I have double major in my first undergrad. It's psychology and philosophy.
we don't know each other. So we felt that I felt that at the very least we should talk to each other, and then if there are other people who are going to join, then that's even better. And that this can become a kind of institutionalized way, because many mistakes in the field we feel are being made based on a lack of attention to the philosophical reasoning, which is different than sociology and psychology and the others, which are very important, but it doesn't have quite some of the things that we think about in philosophy. So that's the genesis of how we thought about a series of topics to at least talk to each other about, and if everybody else is there too, then we have a bigger conversation.
Right.
That's the way we
Right. And also, you've done work, in your many lives, you've done work in religious ethics, you're very up on the philosophers, the modernists, I think, modern philosophers, ancient philosophers. And frankly, I'm going to tell, I think I told you once this, my transition in the field was about 12 years ago, and one of the first two books I read were Marc's, and I said, this is deeply philosophical, but he doesn't use any name of a philosopher. I know that it's deeply philosophical just by the issues and the movement of ideas. So anyway, so as Marc said, and related to Marc's point about the need for philosophy, it's obvious our field is so new, and our field basically needs to borrow and import and call upon the wisdom from other disciplines in certain respect. Okay, so I'm going to say a few words, and then Marc, and then we'll just,
then we'll open it up.
Then we'll open it up. Okay, so we all know about the power of language. We all know that in certain settings, language can move people. It has a force, and I mean that literally. That in the use of language, it's an action with potential capacity for enormous change. Every speech, every time someone says something, or in newspaper, it has the capacity to change. And we all know can change by emotions, by thinking, change by agitating people for action, but it changes. And it also can promote ideas, it can hide, it can affect the mind in ways that the listener or reader doesn't realize. Okay, so a flagrant example of this, and I'm just starting off with a real simple example, is something that from one of our research projects on Rwanda, the media campaign by the Hutu extremists in the years preceding the war, the genocide, and this is just one statement. So this was in a newspaper article. Notice the history of Rwanda shows us clearly a Tutsi always stays exactly the same, that he has never changed. The malice, the evil are just as we knew them in the history of our country. So here we have a classic, clear example we all know about essentializing, universalizing, and, as it were, eternalizing, if that's a word here. In other words, this defines them. And that is one of the key elements, obviously, in demonization, is
Essentializing, universalizing, what's the third?
Eternalizing.
Oh, yeah.
They're always like that. So those three cognitive, those are cognitive instruments. Those are instruments for cognitive change, which are, dare I say, universal. Philosophers like to talk about things that are always the case, but I'm really, now I know I should not. But when we talk about demonization, that's what demonization of the other really amounts to cognitively, and especially the defining. And there's a rhetorical trick there, about the sense of authority when someone says the history of, I am the source of history, suggesting an authority. We don't want that. Okay. So park that for a minute and then think of the idea about grammar.
Can you repeat it again, just so I will?
Okay.
Universalizing.
Okay, so the three cognitive processes that I think illustrated there are to essentialize, to define them. They are defined as inherently evil. We all know lots of cases like that. They're all evil, and they'll always be evil. So that's the time factor. Yeah, it's pretty routine in our field. And the other thing interesting about this is how do people define the other? Well, a common strategy is define it through their origins. Anthropologists have shown this, Eliade and some other anthropologists. From where they came. They came from those regions. The Tutsi are not really Rwandans, and so on. And the other thing relevant here, again, I know what I'm saying, it's obvious. There's a shadow existence. There's a shadow realm here of Hutus. There's a shadow cognitive process. Because when we read this, whoever reads this is going to tacitly understand that the Hutus are not all of those things. Although they could be essentialized also. Mm-hmm. So the essentialization process, I think, is the same in this shadow world. Think of another realm of being, entity, or in this case, category, being the Hutus, in this case.
You have a fourth, which is it's reinforcing the historical sweep. It's very important. What you're saying is, and Dan is philosopher of the history of science too. So that's the big part here is that history is doing the essentializing, universalizing, and
that's why I asked to repeat, because I think one more, maybe you mean it, but you didn't tell it. I think the whole idea of normative prescription here is what should be done.
What a great idea. Right. And may I say, Karina and I have enjoyed writing about the normative dimension of identity.
Yeah, I think this is important because this provides a lot of normativity.
Well, of course, I agree. And I think the normativity comes out in each of those elements. Because the categories are inherently normative. The evil, what is essential? Evil. Yeah. And what's the shadow essential inherent nature of Hutus? Virtue or victim. Innocence or whatever. Okay, so let me throw out just a philosophical concept. Ready? Okay. So we can look at this superficially and talk about what is called the surface grammar of these words, and many people have, obviously, and it's relevant. But we can also look at this more deeply, and the more deep analysis is in understanding the realm of constructs that are deployed in the surface meaning of these words. Okay, so what I mean is, what are the underlying assumptions about what is real and what is good and bad, and what are even experiences? What are the underlying assumptions of what's real and what's good and bad, morality, and experiences that make this meaningful for Rwandans? Okay, and that is the philosophical quest. And I just mentioned 3 questions, but there could be lots more. And let me just mention a philosopher who has changed the way of thinking, not just about philosophy, but about knowledge and so on, is Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant created a revolution in philosophy in the late 18th century that has shaped and directed so much of the idea of what inquiry is, what understanding is, especially in Europe, but also in the United States. And he raised a fascinating question. He said, well, how is knowledge possible? Well, we don't start with these abstract principles. By the way, I'll get back to an example. I just need 1 minute on this. We don't start with abstract deductive principles like Spinoza did, or Plato did, about the realm of existence, then you deduce them and so on. He says, no, you start with an example of genuine knowledge. And you say, what are the preconditions that we are assuming in order for us to say that this is true, that this is knowledge? What must I be assuming? And for Kant, it's assuming certain processes in the brain, in the mind, not brain, mind, that must be operative. Must is not, doesn't mean that the mind is defined in a certain way. Sorry, he said it did, but later said it could be changing. Must means the preconditions. What are the preconditions that are operative in order for a claim about the color of a desk, something very simple, a stone warming, he wrote about. What are the preconditions about reality, about knowledge, about ourselves? And his revolution is to say the preconditions are about ourselves. So he began this enormous enterprise, or enterprises plural, of critical reflection. And to this day, we are influenced by that in this building. We are influenced.
Could you define for people what you mean by critical reflection? Because I was reading about, nobody understands, everybody misinterprets what Kant meant by critique.
Right.
So could you more clearly define that for non-philosophers?
He was the answer to the question I just mentioned. What are the, what must be true about ourselves and the world in order for us to have accepted a claim that the stone is warm as accurate? So let me, by analogy, it's like, what must I learn in order to drive a car? What must be true about the car's mechanism? Now there's no combustion engine, everything's so electrical, and so on. So that's a simple analogy to what he's saying is universal about all knowledge. So what must be true? So for Kant, his answer to the question was his set of categories about the mind. And they were very rigid, and people said, whatever, they're too universal. But his question was expanded and continued for generations after, to the point of 20th century philosophers of language. So the brilliant philosopher of language is Wittgenstein. So just one more point and I'll get back to this. Wittgenstein took Kant's project and applied it to language, but he wasn't the only one. Many people did this. Positivism is a legacy of Kant. Logical positivism, the form of knowledge inquiry, is a legacy of Kant because they were very strict. So Wittgenstein, in later work, said, okay, we know what the surface grammar of something, the definition of the word, Tutsi, but what's the depth, the deep grammar? So deep grammar is his answer. His notion of deep grammar is his answer to Kant. That is, for deep grammar, he says, what must we assume to be true about ourselves and about society in general in order for me to understand the meaning of the word Rwanda? Okay, well, you have countries and so on. So you have nation states. That's pretty obvious. Tutsi, that gets tricky. What must be true about our understanding about Tutsis, as well as others, non-Tutsis? Who are the non-Tutsis? Well, in this case, it was Hutus and Twa, and so on. What must be true? Well, so Wittgenstein drew our attention to enormously wide-ranging realms of possibility. And what I mean, I really want to focus on this idea of realm of possibility.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. We'll talk
I
later.
have a prior meeting.
So what's a realm of possibility? We know what realms of possibility are. We know what it means to define Tutsi as a race, or an ethnic group, or a social, political group, very politicized, or a group that is defined by the legacy of colonialism, redefined and cast. So it's not just different definitions on the surface, it's different ways of thinking about the meaning of Tutsis. And to this day, this idea is extremely controversial. I want to talk about the idea of being a Tutsi. It's controversial because analysts aren't really sure. I even read a judge's testimony. He says, I'm going to talk in the Rwandan trials, and a footnote to the judge's response was, I'm going to talk about Tutsis, but I realize that this is an ethnic group without an objective meaning. Which then I was wondering, what did he mean? In other words, there's no objective indicators for defining Tutsis. So what Wittgenstein did is draw our attention to ways of thinking that are below the surface of how we use words. And he said, if we don't really understand these different ways of thinking, we don't understand ourselves in using language. In other words, one avenue to understand self and other is to see the assumptions that we make in communication. And that's his answer to Kant. And the assumptions, again, are wide-ranging. He focused more on the social conditions. You could do a Foucault. I think I see Foucault as in the legacy of Kant. Habermas, definitely in the legacy of Kant. Many people, and they brought their different lens to the meaning, to the understanding, not just of language, but to understanding a realm of being in which we're engaged in conversation.
What was the one that psychologized all of it? Englishman said that he said, when you say this is wrong, you're saying I don't like this. In the subtext, what was his name? Ray or Roy? Not Rorty. You know what I'm talking about?
There was Geach or a positivist or a psychologist.
Yeah. It's a radical critique of all ethical language. That's saying the ethical language is really, I don't like this. I love
that was the Stevenson. Well, there was a guy Stevenson.
Yeah, there was others too.
There were others too.
Yeah,
that's right. He may have been.
But that was a deep text language.
So that was the thing that
actually a total deconstruction of language.
Yeah, it's like because he said.
Actually, Bauman was also speaking about it.
Bauman? Oh yeah.
Yeah, he was speaking about the idea that it's irrespective of how we change identity. It's actually how we start seeing the world in completely different.
Right. Wasn't Vygotsky also very influential?
Vygotsky was more speaking about cultural. Yeah, he was speaking a lot about cultural foundations of knowledge. He was anti-Peugeot.
Piaget.
Yeah, very anti-Piaget.
I think Vygotsky, I read somewhere, he was also, with respect to a cultural lens on the use of language.
And also Bakhtin, dialogue.
Oh yeah, definitely Bakhtin. Okay, so Bakhtin is like
Bakhtin, the whole dialogue, the creation of meaning through dialogue.
And we reveal ourselves in conversation and so on, and he really gave insight. He didn't invent that. That idea actually comes from Aristotle.
Exactly.
And others. So we could ask this question: what's the depth, the deep grammar of not just Tutsi conflict? I'm still working on reconciliation. I don't really have a handle on what that means, and lots of our terms in our field.
So just pipe in and we'll open it up to my take on this, because I have a double legacy, because I focus this. I spend a lot of my life in private with my brain and philosophy, but in public or in my practice, I'm not operating in philosophical categories. I'm not constrained by them. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. I have a radical approach to practice that focuses on the situation speaking to me. It's a version of Lederach's approach to radical conflict practice, which evolves out of the situation. There's no imposition on a situation, and so that and I feel that Lederach has actually taken the field back to a true empiricism, because true empiricism in a radical sense is I don't know anything. what is happening here. And that has led to far better practice in my experience. And then from there, the empiricist then starts to search for scientific patterns, but not imposed. And that a lot of the bad practice I've seen in the field, particularly by governments and larger agencies and wealthy agencies, has been Platonic. It's been an imposition, either from Plato to Spinoza, on reality that often destroys reality in the process. So that the more Aristotelian approach, and I think reaches full achievement in Lederach's approach, is the radical receptivity to the isness of what's happening there. Then I start to look for patterns. And I also start to ask myself basic questions that are the same questions that Kant asked. What is real? And what ought I do about it? And so that question, which he called what is real, is the physics question for him. What ought I do is the metaphysics question, metaphysical. I was on the way here, I was just listening to the metaphysics of the foundations of metaphysics of morals by Kant, which I highly recommend. It's far, far more accessible than the critique of practical reason, which is impossible. I've been reading recently sympathetically that a lot of us authentically can't understand Kant because they were just at the beginning in that time of developing new German language around philosophy. So much had been in Latin, and they actually were developing it. So the reason why we can't understand Kant half the time is because they were inventing new words. And then we read the translations if we're not German, so it's even harder. But the metaphysics of morals is more accessible. But basically coming back and doing a take or a midrash on what Rothbart is saying, Dan is saying here, is my practical questions. My practical problem is that essentializing, universalizing, eternalizing, and prescriptive, which Dan refers to as all the elements of demonization, which is so important in genocide and killing in general, and enemy systems, are also the essential elements of how Kant came to what is a moral prescript, a moral idea. That the only way from Kant to Rawls to figure out what's right is to step back from a situation and say, can this apply to all human beings at all times? Right? Can it be a categorical imperative as opposed to a hypothetical imperative? How do we come to universal principles? The human rights, the doctrines of the Bill of Rights. When you're in a bad situation and you don't know what to do, very often you have to step back and say, what are the basics here? And can it apply to everybody? Should I, what should I do with this particular situation where somebody is in a terrorist group, but they're also saving lives? So what do I do with that? What's the principle? And so I go back to Kantian categories. What would apply to all places and all times? So I have to extrapolate from a messy situation where I'm in Syria and the woman who's saving children's lives, who's an amazing human being, is being protected by a terrorist group. What's the principle? Do I say, oh, I can't talk to you? Is that, where is the principle? So I go back to Kantian categories sometimes I go back to utilitarian categories. The utilitarian Millian approach is to try and size up what would create the most misery or the most happiness based on what you do, which is a difficult principle because it asks you to predict the future. Kant doesn't ask you, he says, come to a principle and live by it. But we all know, and he's been criticized because that gets very rigid, very hard to apply in reality. The utilitarians say differently. They say, try to predict where you think is going to be the best results. And we all know from practice that that's exactly what we struggle with all the time. So, the very same Kant is recommending the development of these eternal principles, and yet we say that in some warped universe where the brain somehow goes bad, and somebody, whether it be Hitler or whether it be some genocidal bishop in Rwanda, decides that all of those essential categories apply to this human being. Everything that Kant recommended in how you train your brain to find a principle. Because Hitler did find a principle. The principle was the Jews must die in order for history to go forward. And he did historical sweep, he did essentializing, he did universalizing, and there he came to a principle. So that's why I think philosophy is really relevant. Because every day you're facing these questions that in some ways demand you to have a metaphysical question of what ought to be, and some degree of essentializing and universalizing. And yet at the same time, these are the principles of how everybody gets killed. So that's part of what I'm struggling with in the field. And I love the two questions, and I just made the connection because you did, is that Kant's basic questions, what is real, and how am I knowing that? And what is right, and how am I knowing that? Are the two questions that anybody who's been involved in insane conflict will ask themselves, whether you're in the middle of Yemen and you don't know what the hell is going on, and you don't know who is acting. You're asking yourself all the time, what is real here? And that is, it looks like the Kantian discussion, which is too Germanic technical, is actually at the core of a challenge of conflict resolution practice. It's what is real. I have the same thing when I was working with the Iranian situation. I did not know, because everybody's telling you a different story and nobody trusts anybody. I never knew what was real. So I think that in our field, we need a little bit more training and thinking on being self-conscious and self-aware that those questions are legitimate and we should always be coming back to them. What is real? And how do I know that? And what is right? And how do I know that? And that's where a philosophical training actually would take you back to those questions instead of being swept up in organizational demands, in political demands, in professional demands that sometimes will distract you and actually make you swept along in all sorts of assumptions about language that are not true. And coming back to the language question is these very issues. For example, if you're constantly in a conversation and one side is talking about peace and one side is talking about justice, they're not talking to each other, they're hating each other. What does this group mean by peace? What does this group mean by justice? So that too, the language issue for me, I come to from a different vantage point of what do people mean in conflict situations by the language that they are using. And is it valuable? Is there even a new conflict resolution practice of definition of terms?
Well, that's a good point.
And I've been thinking a lot that as a new form of conflict resolution practice that we might want to consider prior discussions between groups on what can we all mean by the same terms? Can we agree on what we mean by peace and what we mean by justice? And we know that you have different definitions coming in. Can we come to a common definition as we debate what should happen? Because that also, you know, I've seen it time and again for 20, 30 years that because people are talking past each other without common definitions, the conflict gets much, much worse. So those are some of the random thoughts I'm having on the subject of language and conflict resolution at this point.
So what I'm so pleased to be here and think about it, because I'm thinking exactly about it and writing about all these identity issues. And for me, identity is exactly the way how we limit possibilities for this universalization. So the more you become stronger, accepted to particular identity, and people speak about Bauman idea that of this dilemma of security and freedom, then we accept particular identity because we need security, protection from the group. And the more we accept the group protection, the more we have to pay for it. Nothing comes for free. We have to pay with loyalty. The more we're loyal to groups, the more group protected. But the more we're loyal to groups, the less we're free in this universalizing of creating these universal ideas of all mankind. We never think from point of all mankind. We pay this very strong price for our security by actually reducing our ability. It's like mechanisms of limitations. Yeah. So there are like this identity's limitation of this understanding what you're talking about, and people become so normalized in thinking in this particular categories, so they just don't have any option because there are a lot of mechanisms. One of them is history of Rwanda says. Reference to history, it's so powerful that evident, right? Another very important mechanism which you're talking about, dehumanization. So you just took all the people outside moral boundary. Yes, we universalize all others, but these people, it's not apply for them. They're just outside moral boundary for us. So I think that what you're talking about is a wonderful ideal type of Weber, right? But where we have to go, how we get into this ideal type, we really have to understand what mechanism behind this problems for universalization, why we are not thinking about all people as human, but we apply these identity categories. And again, security is very one. Threat narratives, is like, as we discuss it all the time, I think threat narrative are one of the important issues. And I do believe that this, what Foucault, for example, in his wonderful production of knowledge, ideas, and so on, what is really missing is identity. Like, read Foucault, there are no identities. He does not understand that these limitations and the whole idea of reproduction of power and knowledge actually depends on these limitations which are set by the identity groups.
The blind spot in general about identity.
Yeah.
So you wanted to say something?
Actually, I wanted to say that I'm doing a research on a.
Say your name again.
Farzaneh.
Farzaneh.
I'm from Iran. And actually, I'm doing a research on the women's situation in Iran. And I'm trying to bring different perspectives. And I found out that I should do my research based on the paradigm, rather to trying to develop the paradigms, rather than talking about justice, because everybody talking about justice. So how can we develop the paradigms that they are free of values? So we are not talking about values, because everybody talking about justice, every group, every perspective, how through the language we came to this word. And after working with different groups, actually, I found out the Islam working on that. But I found out, I developed a Paulson social cartography. I don't know if you are familiar with that, for a dimensional, from subjective orientation to objective, and from transformation to regulation. So for quarters, I developed it, and perspectives and paradigms, I developed that one. And based on that, I came to the issue that really John Burton's basic human right theory can be adopted to that situations for the paradigms, can bring them together on three issues: identity, security, and role of participation. There is basic human needs theory. So there is no value, and there is no truth. There is no reality you can trying to find out what is the reality over there. This is how they identify themselves. This is what they want as a security for themselves. So they developed where they stand as a paradigm and how come together. So the important thing is who I am, trying to understand what is the truth, what is the value. They are the people who should identify who they are, what are their identity, what security are they looking for, and participation, what role they want. Might be tomorrow they see different. So even we can question as I have worked on human rights for a long time, but even as John Burton question is not universal. It can't be universal until the people come to the point say, yes, it is what I want. It is my identity. But still, it's not that in that level. So this controversial situation, I thought that we can develop paradigms through discussion that different perspectives come and say, what's my identity, what security I'm looking, and what participation role I need to do in this, situation. So this is what I came. I'm not sure if it's where I'm going, but.
Well, I think I've always thought John Burton he's not formulating a theory, he's formulating a perspective.
Exactly.
and it shouldn't be judged in theory, evaluating the theory terms. And the perspective is a realm of entities, needs deprived and satisfied and so on. It's a realm, and the way he presents this is through paradigm cases.
Yeah.
So he has a combination of some very abstract statements plus paradigmatic cases. And plus he blends in multiple, he talks about political and social and identity a little bit, and so on. So I think your point is very well. Very
But the problem is here, just
Technical?
to add.
Oh, that's from Nick. Question from Nick.
Yeah.
Can I just add
Yeah, sure.
very quickly that it's not, what is really interesting about here is that based on Kahn and Wittgenstein and all this, that there are a set of, how we call this, realms of possibilities, right?
Yes.
Realms of possibilities. And the issue is that we constantly reproduce and reproducing new realms of possibility through language,
Yes.
through political participation, and
Exactly.
so on. I think that's what we're doing, but we actually developing new ways how we exclude people. It's all patterns of exclusion and inclusion,
Absolutely.
which actually predict this, like prevent this universalization of the idea. And they constantly reproduce, and actually power is constantly reproducing these borderlines in which morality does not go across the boundary.
Mhm.
This is what
Nick wanted to say something?
Yes, he said, I'm interested in Dr. Rothbart's thoughts, and this is going back a few minutes, on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission initiatives in terms of reconciliation, specifically looking at child soldiers who are participants in the TRC as adults that were labeled the offenders or perpetrators. This might speak a bit to Marc's recent comments on principles that apply to all. The identity of child soldiers as perpetrators being placed on them, etc., and the intergenerational narratives passed on through the myths about what actually happens in war and genocide.
Well, what a wonderful question, and I wish I had the perfect answer. Let me just do a part of the question to the name. Nick. Thank you, Nick, so much for that valuable question. So again, in the theme, in the spirit of what we're talking about, which words do we use, and what are the underlying assumptions? You know, so is a child soldier an offender, a perpetrator, a victim, a casualty of war, whatever. Okay, so once we pick those not just using a couple examples, Nick, that you gave, what does that mean about our own assumptions? Not just the child soldier, but the other. What does it mean about the adult soldier? What does it mean about the civilians? What does it mean about the enemy soldier? You know, is the enemy soldier who the child killed, are they offenders and so on? So it draws our attention to a range of questions that if you're reading just a journalist article about the TRC, you know, journalists don't do this, but we should. You know, that's part of analysis, is to say, what are our assumptions that underpin this use, assumptions about who they are, why they did it, you know, who are the offenders, who are the innocent, and so on. The child soldiers thing is particularly perplexing in philosophical questions because they're innocent and they're perpetrators, as I think Nick was suggesting. You know, and then the challenge is the community, do they accept them back and so on.
How do you define them as innocent?
Well, if the story, I'm just raising this as a possibility, I've read stories which portray them as vulnerable to the military leaders who kidnap them. First they kidnap them, you know,
And because they're under 18,
well, that's another.
you're making an assumption that
Exactly.
they're innocent as a result. And that's where it's a cultural.
Yeah, exactly.
So
It's a
this is-
value-based. It's a value-based. Is it something that?
Exactly.
It's something that John Burton says when it's coming to the social norms and socializations process, and says everybody, and also Galton is against this. Says this is a violation when kids, the baby is born is targeted for all these violations because we are telling them what is good, what's bad, what to do, what's not.
Right.
So
Charles Taylor, didn't Charles Taylor, you gave them drugs?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Corny.
So
But
all-
the question, in some cultures, 18, below 18, somebody would be considered partially innocent, at least because they've been coerced. Some people 13. Others, I've seen radically different African approaches to exactly this problem based on their cultural evaluation. For some who are, one of my students and colleagues was worked with the child soldiers and became a parent to them in Liberia. And his tribal and Christian approach was that he was a parent to these children needed a parent, and he was going to reintegrate them into the group. Other cultural approaches were that they are poison that must be eliminated because they killed their parents.
Interesting.
And it's not based on their agency or lack of agency or brainwash or not brainwash, they're poison. And that culture determined that they're poison. The Bible does the same thing with children that speak back to their parents or something like that. They should be stoned to death because they're poison. So there is a whole series of assumptions here on what, how we define
Absolutely.
the in and the out, based on the values we bring to it. And at some point we're imposing.
In a paradigms area that I made, I have an area of must be of area. Every ideas and perspective talking about must be. Something must be.
What must be?
Oh, I see. So I see. So
But something can be, something will be, and something being
be.
culturally.
Yeah.
So I find it is a really interesting of the playing in social cartography. I think
But I think what is important here that exactly like when you were speaking about this, Mark, I was thinking that exactly like just being age, it does not give them innocence. I think what really is important here is this agency. So did they do it voluntarily or they were brainwashed and put in situation like Connie was just pushing them and killing them and all this. But what is important here, I believe, is that by giving them more complexities and understanding that it's not just all black and white or whatever, like different innocent or non-innocent. If we will apply only innocent, not innocent definition into them, we could not resolve the issue. Because it's always will be people who will tell what you're talking about. But the more complexity, the more dimensions we will give, exactly the same issue with multiplicity of identities. The more multiplicities of identities we introduce, the less salient become these borderlines. So by giving them an idea, yes, they are innocent, but at the same time they are very guilty for doing it. And to find some variations how they should recover from it. Yes, they're poisoned because they brainwashed and they were enjoying killing other people, but how they get there and how to get them back, because just giving them innocence, presumptions of innocence will not help because they're returning back to their villages, continue killing people.
That's what the people are afraid of, exactly.
Yeah, so by not giving them presumption of innocence, but telling, yes, you're guilty, but we understand how you get there. And then you need long time of recovery. You need to start working for your community and integrating slowly into community. You need to trauma healing and all these issues, and it can take years.
And that's why most of these discussions get integrated with issues of rehabilitation, reform, and the belief or not belief in the possibility of reform, which divides Americans, it divides every society as to whether perpetrators are reformable or not. And that is exactly what goes on in a lot of the child soldier situations.
You see, there is no discussion. I'm sorry, just a short notice. The discussions, it's 5 people who were freed from Guantanamo Bay and went to Yemen. One of them is now approaching and trying to be militant again. But yeah, they were released, and what were done to them, right? They were released from the prison, and what do you expect them to do after prison? What programs were created for them? Because again, if you take innocent, okay, now they're innocent. Okay, let them go.
Right.
Does that help somehow?
You wanted to
Yeah, I'm sorry.
The issue of child soldiers it's fascinating because they were children. It allows for people who have this belief that at 18 your consciousness changes, to actually address something that strikes right at the heart of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, which is this problem of not everybody who commits genocide is an essentialized monster that we think that they are, right? So, so the essentialization actually works to discuss the perpetrators themselves.
Right. Yeah.
And child soldiers becomes a very safe way for us to discuss the problem that maybe not everybody who commits genocide and mass murder is evil. And when Truth and Reconciliations work, they allow for the very things that Marc was talking about, discussions over the exact opposite of the essentializing what's happening in our little sentence up there. It allows for, and this is something that both of you brought out in your comments too, that allows for discussions of what happened, what do we know about ourselves, and you know, what did we do, and what were the very, very kinds of questions that are erased in the lead up to this violence, right? So
it seems like we don't. Again, why I think philosophy should be helpful here is that very often in our field, and I make a distinction between conflict analysis in our field and conflict resolution practice. There's a real difference in philosophical reflection in those two. In some ways in this conversation, we're mixing them a bit too much, because when I think about the usefulness of Kant and Mill, it's as a practitioner. But as an analyst, it's almost like a whole different set of skills that you need, maybe different philosophers sometimes that you need in order to figure things out. But as far as practice, we're not really honest about our practice on a global scale. We don't want to acknowledge that in 1945, they hung 10 German mass murderers, maybe 20, and then millions of people went back to the streets who had killed massive numbers of people. And they were integrated into society, they were integrated into West Germany, and that was it. You know, and the idea that now we know that it was government programs that integrated them and used them for spies and against Russia, etc. What gives? Obviously, we don't have, our philosophical work needs to integrate better now with, and this is what's happened since Kant, that I think we as philosophers have to acknowledge. And that is that since Kant, psychology has gone massively forward in terms of the science of the brain, the science of obedience, the science of normal people doing terrible things, basically Zimbardo and all the others, that we need to integrate that into our philosophical reflection on guilt and innocence. And also what's reformable and what's not. How people change or not change. We really haven't integrated the lessons of psychology now together with the original philosophical reflections going back to Aristotle and Kant. And that's where you're absolutely right, that children allow us to have the discussion, but if we're mature enough, we really should be having them about adults. Because the fact is that we reintegrate people constantly, we just don't admit it. And it's usually for national interests, not for principal things that conflict analysis and resolution should be more concerned with. It shouldn't be that just by and by governments integrate, killers, because then they do it badly. You know, they give Saddam the coordinates to poison people in Iran. I mean, I know the foreign policy people who helped the government of Iraq to pinpoint the places in Iran to bomb with chemical weapons. We were complicit in that because at the time, we let our government decide that Saddam was a friend and ignore all of the reports about him being a mass murderer. So what is that? So we let it up to governments and obedience, our own obedience, instead of looking at this philosophically, looking at what's redeemable, what's not, how you reform, why in the German case do we say, people have to go home and that it's different? Why was that different? I think there are good reasons why you had people go home in Germany and you didn't kill 1 million people. We could have killed 1 million, we could have executed 1 million Germans. We didn't. And it became this amazing democracy. But in Iraq, it's been one disaster after another by not having our categories and not holding our governments accountable and not looking at the, Where is there reform? Where is there military in Iraq that could be worked with in a more democratic way? We're not. It's been a disaster because we haven't analyzed it in those categories.
Yeah.
So the German case, it would be helpful to understand what really was the framing of limiting it only to 10. And the framing was political, it was...
Part of it was anti-communism.
Anti-communism.
But it was also a democratic state that was being set up in a very solid way.
Right.
So how does that affect the system? How does it affect your moral reasoning as to whether you're putting people back into normality or not? If you release the child soldier, that may be vastly different than releasing them into an education, a rigorous education and reform program that has a high degree of likelihood that they will reintegrate, as opposed to saying, oh, Saddam is our friend now because we're against the Iranian Revolution,
because if you
which is not moral reasoning at all. It's just a narrow raison d'etat.
If you take like another current case, let's take Ukrainian case, very current place. Today I was reading the call of 6 major people, former ambassadors to Ukraine and 2 major generals. Let's give Ukraine lethal weapons.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, let's do it.
Yes.
And then you feel about it, it's the whole simplicity of how the whole conflict is perceived. There is a Russia which is coming into Ukraine and creating the war, and this 20,000 rebels, who are they? Who are they? Who are these people? They just completely taken from the description.
Right.
Again, I'm not justifying their position, but the whole idea that there are a huge group of people who fighting for their position, not Russians, but Ukrainians who live in Ukraine.
It's a civil war.
So what?
It's a civil war. It's a definite civil war. But from the narratives of official Washington, which is I'm fighting
Right.
already for like a year, the whole idea is disappeared. There is a democratic Ukraine and totalitarian Russia came into Ukraine and created a war. But it's what's happened with the whole group of people with it. So we're speaking about bombing of Mariupol, but we do not speak about bombing of Donetsk, where more civilians are killed.
What is it? Philosophical questions or the political?
No, this is
system?
philosophical
It's a
question,
question.
exactly, because how we
How do you
define
define?
what's
So
going
there's
on.
War? Is it a civil war? Is it an invasion?
So that's a case where you have a framing, a civil war framing, but we don't have the comfortable or familiar term for the rebels. So there's a vacuum, there's a linguistic vacuum, which means a cognitive
And
vacuum.
moral
And moral vacuum, that's right. So this is.
It's a moral vacuum. This is what I'm trying to put. It's not
So we don't
politics
have
at
the
all. It's
language
emotion.
which gives us coherent understanding of the rebels, or at least the language is all over the place, apparently, right? I mean, there's lots of words. It's not a shared way of thinking as we would with the leadership in Kiev. You know, the government, we know that language, that's political language. So this, you know.
We also, we don't take seriously all of the polls before and what people actually wanted to the degree we can. So we kind of collapse into very simplistic categories. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of Washington, what we make we're obedient to systems of think tanks and media that themselves have very vested interest in the binaries and polarizing categories. So it makes it very hard to have an empirical examination of what's really happening. That's again why I think conflict resolution practice should be a radical ignorance that is involved in questioning and asking and just knowing that, just like you mapped out things, because say, I don't know what people think about this. This
is great. So what you just said was very creative. I've never heard radical ignorance. That's very, very good. I mean, that's really wonderful because it's so counterintuitive.
There's a way in which John Rawls and John Paul Lederach meet each other. There's a kind of elicitive thinking is very similar to the veil of ignorance of saying, I don't know.
Actually, I think you're doing something that's in a good way a lot different from the veil of ignorance, right? Because you're not judging people void of their position within a society and their role. You're doing a different kind of it's you are acknowledging their role, right? You're saying
That's true.
You're saying you play. This is your social position. You played a role. And actually, I think that strikes directly to one I think of Rawls's major weaknesses. I don't think you can ignore people's roles in society. I think there has to be a role for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I also think one of the reasons why John Paul and I are not too common, especially in getting aid grants and such, is that we accept bewilderment.
Yeah.
There's no way to be a true empiricist of human nature and human experience without accepting radical bewilderment. That you have to, if you're a serious practitioner, you have to say, A, I don't know coming in, and B, coming out, it's likely that I'm going to be confused on a regular basis. So I've been working in Syria for 12 years with Syrians, deeply, every week. And periodically, I will come to that moment of radical bewilderment. I have no idea what they really want. I have no idea. And I come back to that accepted ignorance. Now, that's not good for applying for grants. It's not good for conflict analysis. It's not good for writing a PhD dissertation. But I believe that it is closer to the truth, which is that, and maybe we need to define what truth is, but for me, it is a radical empirical acknowledgement of a very confusing universe until from that universe I discover patterns. And that's what I try to do in my work. And I think philosophy helps in that process, but a lot of this stuff we do with it is usually pretty imposed, including basic human needs theory. Do you know, one of the earliest writings I had was against basic human needs theory because I gave it.
Also, I wrote something against it in the class conflict that is not answering the class.
Yeah, I gave a simple example. My grandmother, 6 days a week in 1920, operated according to Bertonian categories. 6 days a week, she went out there, practically did everything she could to have a measly job for her children. The seventh day of the week, her boss would say to her, in Chelsea, Massachusetts, if you don't come back on Saturday and work, then you're fired. Every Saturday, she would be fired because she chose the Sabbath over her children's survival. And then on Sunday, she went looking for a job. So where was John Burton on the seventh day? So, in other words, Burton, so maybe we start getting into the higher needs and the lower needs and all of this crap. The fact is that he couldn't account for why she made that decision on the seventh day.
I wrote an article, but it doesn't apply the class conflict, and I had a discussion.
So it's a higher, in other words,
but in
out
this
there it's a hybrid.
In a women's area, I found it useful because I found it identity, security, and role of participation as a three important source of the conflict among different perspectives was very important. So this is something that I'm working on that. At the class conflict, it doesn't work, so I'm going to find out because this is another area that I work, find really what the theory can work over there. But here in women situation, I think, at least in Iran, it's working.
Sure.
So.
Sure. Can I Ibrahim had a long time ago.
Well, I want to say many things, but I don't know if I can articulate them right now. I've been driving for the last 14 hours. Don't want to explain it. It's a long story. What I want to do is raise a few questions, which is why are we asking so many philosophical questions with an assumption that things could change either positively or negatively? What makes us think that this is even a possibility? And why is the theme or the paradigm of universality dominating us as if we are in a round table in Washington, D.C., or we're policymakers or we're affiliated with them? So we're conflict resolution academics who sometimes do joint work with policymakers and officials, interveners, and so on, etc. But I see an assumption here that we are all kind of like thinking that things can get better if we address things differently. But we don't know that. And let me tell you this. Even if there's an understanding of what's happening in Syria, even if people in the DC area can come to an agreement between what's ISIL, ISIS, or Daesh, even if they come to that. I have a strong feeling, even if they know exactly what it is, and that things will always have their own challenges. But I don't think that an understanding of if it's really a civil war happening, or if it's the political conflict versus it's an economic thing, what are the root causes of the problem, is something that we can talk about it in a universal sense. And I think this is something that I've learned here at ESCAR is it's so hard to universalize conflict resolution. And what's that?
Is it at all necessary?
No, I mean, I think it is necessary, like, for us to keep raising these questions. I think it's so challenging to go into the different definitions of things, like the definition of truth. How do we define it here, and how do people define it in a different place? And I agree that we should talk about it, but what are the assumptions that are we making here as we're talking about it? So are we assuming that knowing the truth, what's happening really in Yemen, is it going to really change something? Let's look at the history of things and trace these patterns of how people perceive truth and see, if anything could change based on that. I don't know if it's...
Well, you have a lot of great questions there. In fact, you anticipated my question about what, with the TRCs, what is truth? What is the truth there? And so this issue of universality versus idiosyncrasy is a perennial issue in all inquiry, like from the beginning of thinking about knowledge. Like, every conflict is unique, great. So why don't we, then unless we're totally immersed as actors, we don't have knowledge. We give up. That radical idiosyncrasy. The radical universality, of course, you're right. It doesn't resonate to the people. I don't know. There's some balance. Let me go to the truth thing. Desmond Tutu gets up and says, we're looking for truth here in South Africa. We want this to be exposed. We want this to be public. We don't want the naysayers, the deniers and so on. What did he mean by truth? Well, he has, I don't mean personally, but with the TRC. I mean, his truth is the word of God, personally. But in the TRC, and this is relevant to your question, it's the narrative truth of victims. That's the kind of truth that he's talking about. He's not talking about procedural truth of prosecution. Legal. He's not talking about social science of a sociologist engaged in deep, empirical analysis. He's talking about the narrative truth of validating the stories of people who were designated, the despondents, were designated as victims. Well, that then rules out, part of my response to your question, that says, okay, well, we won't try to go to what the social scientist is trying to do to validate what the witness is saying. And that's a normative judgment because these are victims, and therefore we want their individual story to be the national story. Because the narrative now goes from the individual to, that's Desmond Tutu's and the other judges' goals. So what that avoids is, in one way, it's extremely idealistic to think, well, it's idealistic in the sense that you really found the victims, and it's also a problem because you only have a couple victims as opposed to millions of others who didn't go to the trials. And so I think it's necessary before we engage in the practice of TRC, when we talk about truth and justice, we better know what kind of truth that we're talking about so that we're not sidetracked or diverted or have false standards of judging the truth.
What do you mean by we?
Whoever's advocating it to the next TRC and uses South Africa as the model, which is used in dozens of subsequent TRCs or reconciliation commissions. That is a practice. And it is a practice of tremendously complex episodes of events and experiences of probably hundreds of people. In a way, it's the whole country because it's a practice. It is a way to change the social, political dynamic of South Africa.
So-
And to prevent.
So just to
Yes.
concretize what you're saying like, for example, the next TRC, you would want the people setting it up to ask themselves a question. What do you mean by truth? And do you mean the narratives of victims?
Yeah.
A, do you mean who's responsible, which is a different kind of thing.
Exactly.
Totally different exercise. And so much so that you might even say the victims shouldn't speak, like they didn't at the Nuremberg trials, because victim stories are not helpful to establishing the legal responsibility for who the legal responsibility. So I personally think that this is very valuable, and that on the contrary, one of the reasons why our world is such a mess is because we're not asking this often enough. In other words, if we did, it would be bewildering, but it would also be clarifying and uncovering of things that are manifestly unhelpful. So that I honestly believe that we, especially as a practitioner, I think there's two different categories here. Let's take whether we know or not whether oil is at the bottom of ISIS and all these other things. It's better to ask the question than not to ask the question. And it's better to ask the question from many different vantage points, because it may lead to policy shifts that would be more helpful in combating the destructive processes at work. So in my experience, asking these questions actually really does help to clarify conversations. I do a lot of this. I'll say one more thing. In virtual debates on Facebook, which are not the same as policy debates. Policy debates are actually much more problematic. But the Facebook conversations about the Jewish state versus state, take it out of Yemen for a minute, go to Israel. So people never ask themselves, what do you mean by a state? They never say, what do you mean by a state? You said before nation state. I never put states together with nation states. Never.
Good.
Because the state for me is a liberal concept, is a state for all of its citizens. So if you define it as a state for all of its citizens as equals, and then you want to say, well, it's also got a Christian flavor to it, or it's got a Jewish flavor or an Islamic flavor, that's fine. Have all the flavor you want, as long as it's a liberal state where everyone has the same rights. But that's not what many, many people mean by a Jewish state, Christian state, or Islamic state. They mean something where some narrative, law, institutions, and privileges go to one group over another. So we're not defining our terms, and therefore things go around endlessly in these conversations. It would be, my experience is that it's better for people achieving consensus that they clarify what they mean and don't mean. And I did this experiment with a group of Syrians, secular and religious. And we did a positive visioning exercise that was closer to the lessons of positive psychology, which is, instead of talking about the isness, we talked about the ought. What would you like to see? And they came up, and we didn't say one thing, we came up with 20 things that people wanted to see. The one they couldn't agree on calling it a secular state or an Islamic state. But 19 out of the 20 they agreed on. So as they got to define the state that they wanted, they realized that those 19 added up to everything they wanted out of Islam and everything they wanted out of secularity. Mm-hmm. But they didn't call it secular and they didn't call it Islamic. No. So, that exercise in definitions actually led to more consensus among a good representative group. What effect that can have in the long run? That's an interesting question. My experience, actually, after these terrible years of Syria, is that in the end of the day, not enough people saw something to invest in that was an authentic alternative to either Assad or the militants. And it was because these discussions have not taken place among enough Syrian intelligentsia in a guided way that gives people a solid notion of a government in exile that is something that is not bought by Qatar, not bought by Saudi, not by Assad, something else. So that these discussions can actually have a salutary effect in history It made a difference that the United States, at least the white men in 1776, had a program, a very persuasive program about what the alternative would be to British rule. And I think that matters, and it takes endless discussion and definitions of terms and actually philosophy, which is what, the framers of the Bill of Rights had.
They were engaged in it.
Yeah.
And they actually borrowed from the French philosophers.
Even though the French were trying to destroy the revolution.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted exactly to comment what Marc was talking about, because in all my writing and in many books, I was using this ethnic, multicultural, and civic concept of national identity. Exactly, then it's defined for particular ethnic group, religious group, or for rights of multicultural groups still with the boundaries between them, or civic, where it's contact between you and the state without meaning who you are, right? But the more I study this issue, the more I understand, and I start writing about this too, that complexities of we have to perceive them as a Weber ideal types. And the more you see them, it's more complexities or some transformative conditions or transformative situations from one to another. And people, that's exactly what they were talking about. They don't want to be they want to be out of Islamic, they want to be out of something, but they are not even in secular yet. So there are some transformative.
What's transformative? What
I'm trying to find the word.
You mean they want to be out of?
Yeah, exactly. They're not in ethnic concept of national identity or religious concept of national identity already, but they are moving into secular, not there yet.
I see.
And there are these transformative conditions. Like recently, one of my students, she got very interesting thesis about generations in Georgia, I mean in Caucasus. And it's so interesting that young generation tell them, we're a civic society, yes, we are a European country, but then she asks them about rights of minorities, for land, for political participation and so on. So no. Minorities, no. It's only Georgians have ability to be but at the same time that they define Georgia and civic law. There are these transformative stages which people live in, and we really have to take them as a realities. We should not just tell, okay, this is democracy, not democracy, this is ethnic, this is civic, but we have to understand that these transformative stages are realities within themselves.
So that's a history.
Speaking philosophically about
one of the histories that I would like to see somebody write a dissertation on is the history of Christian democracy. Because in the last 200-300 years, there's been successive Christian democratic parties in Europe. And those Christian democratic parties would eventually become radically democratic. So what was the Christian part?
The Protestant work ethic.
What was the Christian part?
Somebody wrote about it.
Where did that go? Because if we're in Malaysia, not in Malaysia, in Indonesia right now, very large Islamic democratic parties. How are they defining Islamic democracy? Because we're so tyrannized by the radical choices, secular versus Wahhabist, that we're not even realizing how many people are defining and struggling and working to define these very interesting positions. So I think that matters in terms of a visionary approach forward to any constructs that we make, but it requires some sort of saying, how is this being defined?
I think in Korea, it sounds like also you're referring to a stage of evolution of kind of like boundary crossing or category uncertainty or vacuity. It's like vacuum. Or there's a stage of thinking with the group where they don't have things they don't have self-conception.
Yeah, but this is very interesting because we see them, because we have this already existing realities, like again, I like this phrase from Wittgenstein, this realms of possibilities, like ethnic, multicultural, civic, shared society. We put them as a transformer, like they live there. This is their reality, and they do not put them here or here. They demand that, like, in moral stance, not demand, but I mean, again, this is demand in philosophical stance. They accept their life and they think and they act from this already, for us, this transformative stage, but for them it's a reality. And they think it's normal. It's normal to be civic and democratic to everyone, but at the same time, normal to deny rights to ethnic
And that's
minorities.
fine, because landowning white men in 18th century England, landowning white men were, and like John Stuart Mill and others, were radical Democrats for white men. And that was really, really, really different
Or
than
founding
the class
fathers.
system. It was very radical. It was completely, it was taking the power of the monarch and the aristocracy and just channeling it massively towards a massive amount of increased people. But it's not what we would call democracy. And that's okay. In other words, they were defining their terms and then moving forward. And I think any kind of elicitive process that we can do on the ground today that helps inch that forward is good practice. It's often going to lead to complicated issues of funding and support. Because, like, for example, often the United States will front end gay rights. They'll just come in and say, okay, what's with the story with gay rights? And everybody will just say, oh my God, you just undermined everything we're trying to do here. And you'll get that kind of debate because they're front ending something that's so advanced for the notion of virtually everyone having the same rights that it's just unacceptable to a lot of places. And what do you do with that? So the history of this suggests that any kind of advance towards great, and this is where my analysis of violence reduction comes from social psychology, any advance towards empathy, towards anyone, starts to begin a process that evolves towards greater rights for everyone. Any kind of, even animal rights in England became the basis for human rights. Animal rights actually preceded human rights in terms of the championship of it. Again, because of the children issue, the obvious innocence of animals or preceded. Ironically, children were further because there was an assumption of evil in children in a lot of places. That is really kind of crazy, but to us today, but it was that case. So any kind of advance is a powerful advance in empathy. And then the rule of law follows that.
So, yeah. You have a short thing I want to.
No, it's
I
just
want to wrap up. No, go ahead.
The first laws protecting slaves were embedded in laws protecting farm animals in the U.S.
Wow.
How much
Could repeat it?
in the U.S. the first laws protecting slaves were embedded in congressional laws to how much you had to feed your farm animals.
What do you mean embedded?
Wow.
What do you mean
Wow.
embedded?
Wow, this is very
interesting. What do you mean?
So
Do you have like a,
Yeah,
can you send the?
So it was congressional laws mandating that you can't starve your horses. You have to feed them a certain amount of grain, and also you should provide your slaves with.
Can you send the reference?
Yeah.
See, that's a great example.
Yes.
That's a perfect example of a mindset that was just shifted, for many reasons. And that happens a lot. There's a conceptual frame about a group, and it's shifted.
But this evidence that animals create more empathy, it's biblical too. The Bible says do not muzzle an animal when it's working so that it can't eat. It's a biblical prohibition. Don't muzzle an animal when it can't eat. The Talmud, 1,000 years later, says you cannot stop a person from eating while they're working. Based on that biblical
That's
law.
amazing. That's great.
So again, this kind of evolution of empathy.
Let me, in a way, these are great questions.
What?
From eating where they want.
Let me go back, Mark, to a question that you started with when we were, discussing this, is what do we mean by success in practice?
That's
which is kind of what we're talking about right now. And I really appreciate Ibrahim's questions.
Actually, the point for another discussion.
Yeah,
exactly.
How
And that's what
How do you define success?
that's what
Big part of
It could be very good idea.
And I want to really validate Ibrahim's question. I'm optimistic about the value of philosophy and for reasons that Marc expressed. But I think it's totally fair, and I have my reasons for validating it. But regarding success, and one way to start with that question is to look at the paradigm cases of success. Don't look at the bewildering. Don't start, I suggest, not don't start with I have no idea whether this is successful or not. Start with, oh, that was so clear.
Has been on the rise, but the philosophical part of it is.
That's right. Well,
I always ask myself, who evaluated the funding at the military spending in Afghanistan, which left $7 billion of equipment rusting for scrap metal? Every one of those programs was evaluated by someone.
I think this
In our
question was
evaluation.
raised actually in 1990s by World Bank, and they answered all the questions and find all the elements. I think in that area of the development, we can find the answer.
Let's do this
What
another
elements
time.
they are.
You want to do this another time?
Yeah, sure.
Let's do the success question.
It's so much fun, guys. Thank you very much.
Well, it is fun. So
This is the way I learn, so I really appreciate you guys.
I would really appreciate you coming, and thank you, Michelle, for
And our
arranging this.
next session is Wednesday, February 18th, which is 2 weeks from
Is that
this
okay
coming
with you?
Wednesday.
Yeah, yeah, it's on my calendar.
Okay,
February 18th.
18th, Wednesday, February 18th.
So every 2
30 to
weeks,
3 in here.
you are planning every 2 weeks?
It's scattered. It's not,
more scattered than that.
it's a little bit more scattered.
I
Let's
think
talk
after
about the
that, it's
dates.
more like one a month through the end of this.
No,
We
but
can
I
make a
wanna-
mailing list for anybody who comes who wants to be on the mailing list.
Yeah.
So do you
Mark,
wanna,
I need to finalize the dates among us three.
Yeah.
Okay, I think.
no, I meant gathering anybody's email who wants to be on a
No,
list
no,
that
I
we would
agree
put
with
out. So if you want to,
That'd be perfect.
then
Yeah,
can we
use a
just,
piece of
can we
paper?
just have a piece of paper?
Sure.
This was a refreshing hour and a half.
So
But we will advertise to the community also, because, obviously other people might,
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
At the same time, right?
It's
we're
1:30.
gonna have 1:30, but the days are,
And it's-
we're
yeah.
switching off.
Wednesday the 18th.
Although I have
12,
to, I'm not sure exactly what we agreed on of the 5 days.
Yeah, we'll look it over together and firm it up, but we're definitely.
so you
We basically agreed on everything except for one day.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you have a schedule for 5 meetings?
Yeah, and we'll
So
let you know what that
in a few
is.
minutes, I'm gonna talk, I'll meet you in a few minutes.